If you search the word testosterone in YouTube, you'll get thousands of videos telling you how you can increase your testosterone with various exercises. There are a lot of people making some pretty insane claims, but which of these claims actually have any evidence? Today, I'm going to walk you through the evidence on what type of exercise actually helps increase testosterone. Let's go. All right, welcome back everybody to Season 4, Episode 9 of the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast, where our goal is to help you stay active and healthy for life through practical and actionable information. I'm Jordan Rennicke, your host. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Today, we're talking all about exercise and testosterone, right? If you go online and you are looking at social media, testosterone is talked about everywhere, and every single person seems to have an opinion, and I guess I do as well, because here I am on a podcast talking about testosterone. But you'll see a lot of insane claims. It's actually quite overwhelming. Like if you just scroll through and see that someone's talking about this testosterone this testosterone that, and if you do this, it's killing your testosterone. It's just so much to handle. Obviously, this whole podcast, season, we've been talking about testosterone and whatnot, but specifically we're talking about exercise, right? People talk about, hey, you need to do X, Y, and Z exercise to get testosterone, but it's overwhelming. So we're going to kind of break it down here and hopefully simplify this and make this practical for you. And when we look at the data, we really don't know that much. It's kind of disappointing. So it's not nearly as settled as everyone online will have you think it is, but that's okay. We do have some data. Let's go through it and we'll get it figured out. So let's get started. First of all, it wouldn't be a podcast talking about testosterone and exercise if we didn't talk about resistance training, right? Everyone loves lifting weights. If you're listening to this, you're probably a little bit biased towards lifting weights, as I typically am. But that being said, we understand every type of exercise is beneficial. So that being said, though, resistance training is the one that everyone touts as this is so important. It's so important to raise testosterone. And what does the data show? Well, yeah, it looks like if you do have resistance training as a part of your program, it can increase your testosterone. But let's talk about it here. First of all, there's kind of some caveats, right? So if you just kind of go into the gym and say, okay, I'm just going to do 2 sets of 10, super lightweight, and don't break a sweat, that's not going to do anything for your testosterone. Like I said, I'm not going to say, hey, if it's either that or nothing, I'm obviously going to pick that. I'm always going to, pick activity and exercise over nothing. But it seems like to get a raise in testosterone, we want to have a higher intensity. So higher intensities seem to raise testosterone. Also might raise other things like IGF-1 and growth hormone. So kind of getting a good benefit of multiple hormones from exercise. And it also seems to be related to the muscle mass use. So what I mean by that is exercises that use more muscles tend to have a higher probability of increasing testosterone acutely. So what do we mean by that? Well, large compound movements. People talk about compound movements, things like deadlifts, squat, bench press, things like that will be very beneficial. But the reason that we believe this is they've done some studies also showing that people will use small muscles and they, work them to fatigue. So pretty much like failure, and they don't see an elevation in testosterone. So it's really kind of that large muscle group using as much muscle mass as possible. That seems to get us that response. And like I said, so if you're just doing isolated bicep curl, right? You just hammer that out, you get the pump, it feels good, but it might not have the systemic effect. The way I kind of think about it is we need to really kind of shock the body, and we need to really kind of put a significant amount of stress on there through, compound movements to really get elevation in our testosterone. So on top of that, they also looked at, hey, are free weights or, dumbbells, whatever, are those better than machines? And it seems like possibly, obviously you can still fatigue yourself quite a bit with compound movements on different machines, but it seems like in a couple of studies that free weights might actually be a little bit better. Like I said, odds are that's just because we're incorporating a little more muscle mass when you do that, right? So when you're on the free weights, you have to use all your big muscles, but then also you're kind of stabilizing and working on different activation and core activation, all those things. This is all theoretical, but that's typically what's happening. That's kind of, if I had to guess, why we're seeing those results. One specific paper I looked at was showing an increase in testosterone with a combination of moderate intensity, higher volume, and shorter resting period. So if we break those down saying, hey, we kind of know higher, moderate intensity. So it doesn't have to be like 10 out of 10 RPE. Like we don't have to go to failure. That is not something we have to do. But we're going up there and it's challenging, right? Like the recommendations we pretty much talk about are RPE anywhere from 6, 7 and above. As long as we're getting a moderate intensity that we're working hard, that can be it. And then higher volume, meaning more reps is typical, or more sets. So that seems to be beneficial. And then shorter rest periods, right? So essentially what that's doing by having a shorter rest period, we're essentially increasing the intensity because we're not waiting as long, we're not resting as long, so we're not fully recovered. So we're just making it harder. So like I said, that can happen. And what do we see when we see this? Well, we see spikes in testosterone, right? That's the thing with pretty much all these studies. We see, hey, what did testosterone look like before? And then what it looked like after? And they kind of measure and say, oh yeah, it's definitely spiked. But then what they see is a lot of times it's transient, meaning it kind of comes and goes. This is not like, hey, if I consistently work out, I'm just elevating my testosterone here and it's going to stay there for the long run. It doesn't seem to be the case. A lot of times it kind of comes and goes, and it's not very long lasting. A acute bout of heavy resistance training A lot of times we see spikes up to anywhere from like 30 minutes to an hour, maybe sometimes 2 hours. That's like the majority of things. There are some things saying, hey, you can maybe see a little bit elevated after 48 hours, but the majority of times it kind of spikes up and then goes back down. So that being said, right, we're saying, okay, well, man, we're increasing testosterone. That means we're going to have, we're going to get huge with this and it's going to increase our muscle size. And that doesn't necessarily play out that way. It'd be awesome if it is, but it does not seem to be that we can do that. Just because of elevated testosterone does not equate to increased muscle protein synthesis, right? So we need muscle protein synthesis to kind of make our muscles and for hypertrophy to get our muscles bigger. And just because we have elevated testosterone levels does not mean we're going to have that elevated muscle protein synthesis. And by proxy of that, we essentially can't use elevations in testosterone to predict hypertrophy potential for humans. So like I said, you can see someone's spike in testosterone after the exercise, and based off of that, you can't say, oh, that person's going to have really good hypertrophy. It just doesn't seem to match up. And so an increase in testosterone does not guarantee hypertrophy. That's kind of how it goes, which is kind of weird. There's a lot of nuance to this, but it's not as easy as, hey, my testosterone goes up and therefore I'm going to get jacked and therefore it's awesome. And if I do that, that's going to be high testosterone. Like that is not the case. We can have these transient spikes and it doesn't equate to anything, meaning like long lasting. So that being said, who's going to benefit from like resistance training? And that's kind of the big question. And first of all, obviously everyone should be resistance training, but in terms of are there people that it will seem to help from testosterone long-term? And it does seem to have an increase in testosterone in like every group that we've studied. So meaning if you're sedentary, you don't work out, if you are an endurance athlete, if you're resistance trained, everything, testosterone will increase. But like I said, it is usually short-lived and most likely it's going to be benefit from resistance training. And we'll talk about that more a little bit in endurance training, but it's a spoiler alert that like anybody, no matter what level of activity you do, will benefit from resistance training. Whether you've never worked out before or whether you work out all the time, like that's good. And actually what's interesting is those who train more, so people who did resistance training more, tended to have higher spikes in testosterone, which is kind of interesting. So it's almost like you're primed, like your body knows it's ready for it. Or is it just the fact that you can lift more and put more stress on your body? I don't know, not exactly sure, but it seems to be that lifting is a good idea. Least shocking news of the day, I know, right? But I'm always going to preach that. And for my question is, well, people talk about testosterone all the time, like Jordan, people take it and they get huge. How does that work? Like I said, that's kind of different. It seems to be a different response than your just a normal response exercise. Obviously that's longer term. But that being said, how does it work? Well, testosterone can increase muscle size by increasing amino acid uptake and protein synthesis, right? So if we are having some potential increase uptake of amino acids and we're making proteins, that's good. And then also one thing it does is it inhibits protein degradation. So it kind of counteracts cortisol. And so it kind of gives a more positive environment or hormonal milieu, will you say, for growing muscle. And that's like one of the big things is testosterone does is kind of sets the environment, and it doesn't necessarily say, hey, testosterone necessarily makes the protein or leads to hypertrophy, but it kind of just gives you like all the stuff you need, saying, hey, we're going to make this as optimal as possible. And then your body's saying, hey, cool, I'm all set up for success here. And that's kind of what it does. All right, next we're going to move on to endurance athletes, right? People always talk about resistance training. They say, oh, resistance training for elevating your testosterone, but they never really talk about endurance training. Is there something to that? Well, let's talk about the data here. Most of the data is in elite athletes who are runners, like I said, the elite runners, and then cyclists as well, but it's kind of like more wide range, anywhere from amateur to elite cyclists as well. And there are some overlying principles that, yeah, you can still increase your testosterone through endurance exercise. Once again, it's going to be kind of transient, like we see with resistance training, but you can definitely see it. There's a couple of things that would increase your chance of having an increase in testosterone with endurance training, and that's specifically number one, your intensity, right? There's kind of a certain threshold or intensity that has to be hit in order to induce changes in serum testosterone. So like I said, if you're just going out on a casual ride or a casual, run, that's probably not going to do it. It's probably more intense. In cycling, they saw changes when they're at high intensity, when they were comparing it to moderate or low. And then running, they only saw changes once they hit VO2 max of like 90%. So, if you ever get to 90% of VO2 max, like it's not a good time. You are not having fun. And so people will say, if you're going that high, it's not going to be a very like leisurely workout, right? That's not your casual run. 90% is like you are booking it. And so it does seem that it can increase. And they've seen ranges in the endurance literature anywhere from like 18 to 30% increase in testosterone. Once again, only lasted about an hour after exercises. So that seems to be a common theme is that, hey, yeah, we'll have an increase in testosterone, but once again, goes down after a little bit of time. All right, the next concept I want to talk about is overtraining. So the general definition for overtraining is any increase in training volume and or intensity resulting in long-term performance detriments. So essentially, any amount of change in your volume or intensity that leads to you not performing as well, that is overtraining. And this is where we can see a drop in testosterone if that happens. Like I said, a lot of time, if you are getting to that overtraining, your volume is super intense. Like you have high volume, you have high intensity, and that seems to be really detrimental for your testosterone. And kind of, we start to see lots of other issues. Your performance isn't good, but that is one thing. So, when you hear this podcast, you might be hearing the, good things of exercise. And I want you to hear that. I want you to hear that exercise is good and you should do it. Absolutely. But taken to like the extreme, you can have this overtraining. Like I said, this is not something the vast majority of people need to worry about. This is not someone who goes to the gym 3 times a week or 4 times a week, anything like that. That's not happening. But someone who's saying, hey, I want to be a competitive athlete, I'm a CrossFit athlete, I'm an intense runner, things like that, where people take it to like, they're really, really pushing themselves and doing hours and hours of training each week. That is something we consider. So like I said, that is never going to be good for your testosterone or performance. So that's just something we need to keep in mind. And then specifically looking at overtraining, it does seem that volume is worse for testosterone than intensity. So meaning like if you have high intensity workouts, but they're not as long, that doesn't seem to be as much of an issue as if you're just doing lots and lots of volume. So that kind of makes sense there as well. It seems to be general experience that people can tolerate intensity a little bit better than volume. And so like we talked about, how long do these changes last? If everyone on the internet is saying, do these exercises to increase your testosterone, but you're telling me they only last an hour, like what the heck, Jordan? What does that mean? Well, most studies do show that there's a precipitous decline back to around baseline within about 90 minutes. Like I said, what is the reason for this spike? Well, the mechanism's not totally clear. It's possible that you have an LH spike as well with exercise. So if you remember, go back to like our first episode, we talked about how LH kind of goes to the testes and stimulates testosterone synthesis. It can happen, but it doesn't line up perfectly as there's like a 45-minute delay between the LH spike and testosterone. So that doesn't seem to be necessarily the case, but may have something to do with it. From an endurance perspective, they thought that maybe, there's an increased catecholamine release, right? But eventually cortisol kind of increases and that inhibits testosterone production. So it might be that early catecholamine release. From a resistance training perspective, maybe there's a stimulation of testosterone production by stimulating release of, once again, GnRH or LH. And so we're not entirely sure why these spikes happen, but it's definitely a response, right? For whatever reason, our body, when they're under acute stress, says, hey, I need to make some more of this, and we can use that as a benefit. And we do see, like I said, it can kind of prime the environment, but like I said, it goes up and then goes back down. So it is not like, hey, if you work out, you're automatically going to boost your testosterone. It's going to stay there long term. That doesn't seem to be the case. And then a question we kind of have on top of that is like, well, do these spikes in testosterone lead to positive changes, right? So we're doing this. Is it these spikes that are causing all the benefits from exercise that we see? And well, the answer is we don't really know. We're not quite sure. There is a possible explanation that when we have increases in testosterone, this may upregulate androgen receptor expression and increase myofibrillar protein synthesis. So like I said, in layman's terms, they're saying, hey, the androgen receptor is the receptor that testosterone and other androgens bind to. You may upregulate that expression, meaning, hey, there's more receptors around ready to be activated. And obviously we know androgen receptors can do a bunch of different things in terms of increasing muscle and all that stuff. And so it might be just kind of priming the environment, or it may actually increase mRNA translation and increase androgen receptor half-life. So once again, there's more of them, maybe they're hanging around longer. And then with these adaptations, that may lead to optimized adaptations for hypertrophy. So like I said, it's not exactly sure, but we're maybe having an increase in androgen receptors, like kind of around, and then we have testosterone after exercise. And so it's like we have more receptors and more testosterone, boom, that's like a match made in heaven. But like I said, it's still acute. So, but in this acute setting, that is kind of a right environment for having positive adaptations that we want. However, there are caveats. There are studies that show even in the setting of normal testosterone, you can still see similar muscle adaptations, meaning you can still see normal hypertrophy and strength changes without necessarily a spike in testosterone. And so that's kind of weird. You step back and say, what? Like, how can that be? Like I said, it seems like there are some beneficial properties and some things happening from exercise at the cellular level that are attributed just to exercise and not testosterone. So that's why I'm saying it's much more complicated than just testosterone will get you jacked. And we know that, right? If you just have testosterone, but you don't work out, there have been studies that, yeah, you will see potentially some increase in lean body mass, but it's not going to get you huge. It's the actual lifting and, aerobic exercise and all those things, the stress on your body seem to play an important role in, hypertrophy and muscle protein synthesis. All those things seem to play a factor. So it's not just testosterone, it's testosterone plus these cellular changes at the muscle. And that being said, so when we exercise, we have those changes, but then we have testosterone, right? A spike in testosterone from currently exercising, that's kind of like this, once again, perfect situation. You're having a primed environment with the things we need to do to make things bigger and stronger. And like I said, that's kind of where we see the benefit in that acute setting. But then things go down and kind of hang out. And so, like I said, it's not definitive as like why this happens, but that seems to be the general theme. And then kind of one concept I want to talk about as well is how does obesity and age affect exercise changes in testosterone, right? So if you have obesity or you're up there in age, do you still get benefits and testosterone changes with exercise? Let's talk about it first. So in obesity, it does seem to increase in whether you're obese or non-obese. We do have an increase in testosterone, but there does seem to be less of a response in obesity. So once again, you will see an increase in testosterone with the exercises we've talked about, but it seems to be kind of blunted and less than those who are non-obese. From an age perspective, once again, we still have an increase and we'll have like the same similar styles kind of affect it, meaning high intensity, resistance training, all that stuff. Just once again, the response is not as high. And then so when we're older or we have obesity, like I said, we are going to see similar changes, just not to the level we would normally see. And so the big question we all have is, do these acute changes in testosterone with exercise, do they lead to an increase in basal resting testosterone levels? So when I mean basal resting, I mean kind of your steady state. If you get your blood drawn, what is your testosterone level? Does that increase with exercise? And overall, exercise in and of itself doesn't seem to be playing a huge role in raising basal testosterone levels. I'm sorry if that disappoints you, if that kind of goes against everything you've ever heard, but it doesn't seem like exercise is the biggest factor in raising your basal testosterone levels. In fact, some chronic exercises had a decrease in testosterone. Like I said, we're probably getting into that functional overreaching or overtraining area, but that's just a different caveat that like, hey, it's not a guarantee. And then based on the data, exercise has a neutral or negative effect on basal testosterone. And like I said, negative, not like negative in terms of like, oh, you shouldn't do it, but we're saying if you go too far, it can show negative effects on testosterone. And otherwise it's like kind of neutral. Like we said, those acute spikes we know are good. Exercise is fantastic. We know that, but we don't quite understand like why it does what it does, right? Because all we're doing is we're stressing the body. We're, having reactive oxygen species. We're having oxidative stress from all these like stressful things that are quote unquote bad, but like we know they're good for us from exercise. So the question we still don't fully understand is why is exercise so good for us? And it kind of goes hand in hand here. Like why are these spikes in testosterone? Like why is that a thing? And what do they do? But overall, based on the data, it doesn't look like exercising or resistance training has a huge impact on your basal levels of testosterone. And so the one caveat I want to talk about here is that we actually may see a long-term increase in testosterone in those who have excess adiposity or those who have obesity. It's kind of contradictory to lean individuals, but like I said, we do see that potential basal increase in testosterone in those who have obesity. The question is there something specific about that? Is the obesogenic environment kind of primed for any sort of improvements? And hey, if you exercise, we're ready to turn this around. Or is the fact that they're losing weight with exercise, as we know, losing weight can have an impact on raising testosterone. So not entirely sure on that, but that does seem the situation where, hey, exercise does seem to raise up your testosterone, but is it, like I said, just from the weight loss? We're not entirely sure, but that is what we've seen. And from an age perspective, we may see an increase in basal testosterone in sedentary older men, but not clear. So once again, it's not like, you're just going to see this huge increase in basal testosterone with exercise. And some studies actually suggest that you can't tell the difference between lifelong exercisers and sedentary individual older adults. So that's kind of depressing there. But it means that there's probably a large lifestyle and genetic component that kind of sits and plays into your resting testosterone. So like I said, testosterone is tricky and it's complicated, so we're not sure. And so what's my takeaway? Well, my takeaway is exercise is good. Sorry if I just wasted 20 minutes of your life because you already knew that. But overall, resistance and aerobic training are good for you and may have positive effects on testosterone, but not in the way most people think. But either way, regardless of pre-existing conditioning, body weight, or age, resistance exercise that consists of larger muscle groups, higher volume, sufficiently intense, meaning moderate to high intensity, and shorter rest intervals seem to result in an acute spike in testosterone. However, these spikes don't necessarily equate to long-term increases in our testosterone. That's like the take-home point there. And for specific age and other comorbidities, understanding that we may see a lower spike in older men and those who have obesity. So once again, we still expect to see positive changes, but not necessarily to the level of those who don't have obesity or are younger. So like I said, the caveats here, there's lots of variables of these studies, like exercise intensity, duration, type of exercise, the different populations you looked at. So it's really hard to fully determine, what this all means. And so what's my take on this? Well, my take is that you shouldn't worry about optimizing your testosterone. I think that's a waste of time. I think you should optimize the things you want to get better at, whether that's strength, hypertrophy, or endurance. Work on those things and don't worry about the rest. The only caveat to that is making sure we're not going too far in the other direction and we lead to overtraining, which can have a decrease in testosterone. But otherwise, I just want you to work out hard, because that is the most important thing that we can do. The act of exercising is the most important thing we can do for our overall health and for our overall testosterone levels in terms of like optimizing our body composition. There's nothing inherently special about any specific movement that will take you from a resting testosterone level of 300 to 900. That's going to be a whole lifestyle change. There's no one tricky exercise that you need to do, but I just want you to exercise and exercise hard with intensity and be smart about it. But that's going to be the biggest thing. And so focus on those things and focus on getting better on the things you want to get better. Don't focus on increasing a testosterone number. I think that's kind of a waste of time. And so we are finally done. Thank you so much for following along. I appreciate it. If you would, sign up for my mailing list. I email you about once a week to kind of let you know anytime I have a new video, podcast, or article that comes out. I never spam you. I hate spam, so we don't ever do that. But there's a link in the show notes. And so thank you so much for following along. I appreciate it. Now get off your phone, get outside, and enjoy the rest of your day.